Hey guys, it's hard to believe it, but we are now at the very end of the Cold War. We have covered so much in this unit. We talked about where the Cold War started right after World War II in the early 1950s with Joseph Stalin, and we looked at containment, détente. I mean, we've covered so much stuff in the Cold War, but now we're coming to the very end, and of course the very end involves the end of the Soviet Union. So in our last set of videos, we were talking about how communism collapsed in Eastern Europe. So places like Poland, East Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, all those countries gave up on communism. And there was only one left in Europe, and that was the original communist country, the Soviet Union. So we're going to focus now on how this country basically collapses and why there is no Soviet Union today. Our story is going to really revolve around a man named Mikhail Gorbachev, or Gorbachev, some people pronounce it that way. He's the guy who's going to bring all kinds of new changes and reforms to the Soviet Union, reforms and changes that turns out the Soviet Union was not strong enough to actually withstand. But to understand where Gorbachev comes from, we need to kind of take a step back and look at some of our Soviet leaders we've covered this year. We know the original Soviet leader, of course, was the guy who founded the Soviet Union, Vladimir Lenin. He was succeeded by the awful, psychopathic Joseph Stalin, the guy who killed probably in the tens of millions of people. His policies at least killed anyways. Stalin dies in 1953. Now, who came next? Well, if you remember back to the earlier part of this unit, we learned it was a guy named Nikita Khrushchev, or Khrushchev. He was the Soviet leader, for example, who had presided over the Cuban Missile Crisis. And when he had basically backed down, it led to his resignation. And he was replaced by Leonid Brezhnev. And so these are kind of our core Soviet leaders. And Brezhnev is going to rule the Soviet Union for about 20 years. And then what happens is in 1982, he passes away. And this was a major turning point in Soviet history, because this is the guy who had presided over the Soviet Union for a better part of 2 decades. He had been ruling a country that economically was growing in the 1950s and 60s and then stopped under his leadership. And in the 1970s, the country really stagnated and declined pretty rapidly, especially as we got into the early 1980s. Now, when he dies, the Politburo, which is kind of like the Soviet Congress, if you want to call them that, they decided they wanted someone who was conservative and, you know, kind of like them. They don't want any of the major changes coming on. So what they do is they focus on a guy named Yuri Andropov, and he becomes the new Soviet leader after Brezhnev dies. Now, Andropov was a pretty hardline conservative guy. He had been in favor of repressing Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968, invading Afghanistan in 1979. So he's very much from the old guard. But he dies within 15 months. In fact, there he is being carried off. And his successor is right here. His name was Konstantin Chernenko. And Chernenko was already very ill when he took over, and he survives all of about 13 months. So we have basically within the course of, about 3 years or so, we have 3 different Soviet leaders. There's a lot of turmoil, a lot of, kind of turnover in the Soviet Union. Now, with the older generation dying off, literally, you have to think, okay, what direction would the Soviet government go? And they decided to go in a more youthful direction, okay? Someone not from that old kind of World War II generation, someone younger with some different ideas, perhaps. And they decide that Mikhail Gorbachev would make the best candidate. Now, when I say he's young, you're going to kind of roll your eyes because he was 54, and that doesn't seem young, I'm sure, to most of you. But for Soviet leaders, that frankly was pretty young. He was the youngest since Joseph Stalin. He had more energy and more sort of outgoing nature than any Soviet leader really in recent past, and his goal is to reform the Soviet Union. Now, Mikhail Gorbachev, as of 2020 anyways, when I'm recording this, he's still alive. He's one of the very few Cold War leaders still around. So this political cartoon, I think, really sums up Mikhail Gorbachev's vision. The Soviet Union is clearly a place that's kind of run down and rickety, and he's got a plan, right? If we can just change this, that, whatever, it can be a dream house. We can save the Soviet Union. And the people of the Soviet Union, they're a little more skeptical, right? They're not quite sure about this planned reform, the Soviet Union. Now, Gorbachev's election as new leader of the Soviet Union, frankly, really appealed to a lot of Soviet people. He's a guy who's kind of stepping away from all that repression and corruption and such, and he's a breath of fresh air. He's a guy who's willing to kind of go out and actually talk to the people. I don't think you can imagine Joseph Stalin walking down the street and talking to people about their problems and concerns and stuff. They would be running from him, right? They'd be afraid of him. And here he's very much a politician, for sure. All right, so when you think of Mikhail Gorbachev, there are two major reforms you need to remember. The first is called glasnost. And glasnost really is just one of many reforms needed in the Soviet Union. I mean, obviously this is a country, you can tell from the pictures, that's got some serious problems. Now, to understand glasnost, we need to kind of go back and think about what the Soviet Union was all about. The Soviet Union was a communist dictatorship where the people really, frankly, were almost prisoners of their own government, where people were encouraged, if not, frankly, required to basically just kind of keep their mouths shut. You didn't complain. You didn't notice a lot of problems, because if you noticed problems, you're seen as disloyal. And so since people were afraid to actually act on their own and think for themselves, things rarely changed and the economy just stagnated. And Gorbachev comes to the realization that that's just not the way you run a government and an economy. You've got to have a free flow of ideas. So he encourages this policy known as glasnost, which is Russian for openness. We need to open ourselves up, talk about our problems, and that's how we're going to strengthen, right? Openness is our strength, the propaganda tells us. So he wants people to openly discuss how to improve society. So in the old days, if you'd worked at a factory somewhere and the factory was inefficient, you didn't say anything. Even if you had a way to improve production, you wouldn't say anything, because then you're seen as disloyal. So you would just kind of keep your head down and ignore the problems. Well, Gorbachev wants you to speak out and to come up with better ways to improve society. Churches are going to be reopened. A lot of political prisoners are going to be let out. And people, for the first time, can actually come out and criticize the government without fearing punishment. All right? This is the Soviet magazine here, Farewell to Censorship. Right? Notice how the scissors can't be used. So if you're a Soviet citizen and you have been told to mind your business and just kind of shut up and do what you're supposed to do and don't complain, and all of a sudden you're told you can, I think you might be a little skeptical at first. But once people start to actually exercise these new freedoms, they really take on a life of their own. And people all of a sudden, are very excited to speak their mind. And they don't have a lot of good things to say about the Soviet government. And I think Gorbachev is a little naive here. He didn't expect that there was this much anger, frustration, and confusion in the Soviet society. And he also didn't expect that people would express it probably as loudly as they did. All right, our second big reform is called perestroika. And perestroika really is all about trying to fix this kind of stuff. So think back to the Soviet economy all the way back to the days of Lenin. It was all about central planning. There's going to be this committee in Moscow who'd make all the economic decisions. They would decide wages and prices and what to produce, how many to produce, what color they were, and so forth. And workers and consumers really didn't have a lot of input. So as a worker, you had very little incentive to work hard because your wage is already predetermined. You're not going to get a raise for working hard, so why would you? And so all these things lead to shortages and inefficiencies and corruption. And so Gorbachev decides to change this with what he calls perestroika, which means restructuring. we need to reform the way the Soviet economy works. So what we're going to do is we're going to allow people to open businesses. We're going to let farmers sell things for profit. So this is kind of the death knell of collectivization, those collective farms. What we're seeing is we're going to start sprinkling capitalism on top of the communist economy of the Soviet Union, which is pretty interesting because those things generally don't mix. Here are some Siberian miners on strike in the 1980s. I mean, can you imagine Soviet workers going on strike in the days of Stalin? I mean, they would have been signing their own death warrant. So this is a totally new world for the Soviet people. Now, it's really, really, really important, though. We need to stop here for a second to think. This Gorbachev is not planning to destroy the Soviet Union. He's not planning to tear the house down. He's trying to save communism from its own inefficiencies and its own corruption. So we're trying to save it, not destroy it. What ultimately is going to happen, though, is just the opposite. Communism in the Soviet Union simply can't withstand these major changes, and they will begin to collapse. Now, there's an interesting sort of pop culture connection to all this. As part of perestroika, for the first time, American companies are doing big business in the Soviet Union. And, you know, the Soviet Union had been telling their citizens for years that America was kind of this evil country that's dangerous, that wants to destroy the Soviet Union. Would the Soviet people buy American products? Well, these pictures, I think, speak for themselves. Yes, because for Soviet citizenry, this was new and exciting and frankly kind of a taste of freedom, and literally, right? They're going to go drink their Pepsi. They're going to go to the first McDonald's in the Soviet Union. I mean, look at this line, right? People couldn't wait to get in there and see what the fuss was all about. All right, we're going to pause here, guys, and pick up in the next video with looking at Soviet foreign policy and see how these changed under Mikhail Gorbachev.